This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I have three scholars on the life and times and writings of Charles Dickens, the British novelist, and we will begin in a moment. Well, I'd like to begin the show by letting my three guests introduce themselves and what they have found so interesting about the writings of Charles Dickens. From left to right, I'll go first. So Anthony Williams or Tony Williams, if you could just take a couple of minutes, say a little bit about yourself and your relation to Dickens.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am currently the president of the International Dickens Fellowship, which is a post one holds for 2 years, so I should be president from 2015 to 2017. I've done various other things for the Dickens Fellowship. I was its joint honorary general secretary from 1999 to 2006. And since 1999, I've been much involved with the Fellowship's journal, the Dickensian, and I'm now its associate editor. My main career before all of that was in secondary school English teaching in state schools from 1969 to 1997, so 28 years as a secondary school English teacher. I'm also a former trustee of the Charles Dickens Museum in London, and I am currently a senior honorary research fellow in humanities at the University of Buckingham, and I've been doing that since 2006.
Did you read Dickens as a child?
Read Dickens as a child with great enthusiasm. It was one of the first things I took out of the local public library when my mother took me there at the age of 4 and a half. And I kept taking it out. It was a Christmas Carol. I kept taking it back, renewing it, taking it out again because I like the pictures.
Okay, thank you. Jay, if you could tell a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. I'm Jay Clayton. I'm a scholar and literature professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm author of a book on Dickens called Charles Dickens in Cyberspace. And this book looks at Dickens's cultural effect down through the centuries and more since his death, and how he's lingered on and been so fashionable and powerful in our culture, both in England and in America, ever since his publication. And it pays particular attention to his relationship to technology and the digital realm, which he anticipated in a number of ways. Just to anticipate, I was really interested to hear Anthony's biography. I've been to many of the institutions where he has done so much work, the Dickens House in particular, a wonderful location. But I must say that I never read Dickens as a child. Part of my interest in Dickens is how his reputation in academic circles suffered so badly in the early 20th century, even though he remained popular everywhere else. And so when I came upon Dickens in my 20s, it was a revelation to me how wonderful this author was that I had always heard was a sentimental Victorian.
Natalie, if you could say a little bit about yourself and how you came to Dickens.
Yes, and I'm turning the volume down a little bit because I'm getting some feedback.
Yeah, I did too. So.
Yeah, okay, good. So hi, everyone, and thanks, Stan, for inviting me on this show. I'm very excited about it. I fell in love with Dickens when I was 4, and I saw Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which I happen to be giving a paper on in Iceland this summer. And if you could come up with anything stranger than talking about Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol in Iceland, well, that's good for you. But I probably decided to focus on Dickens when I was a graduate student, and I had the pleasure of having Elliot Gilbert as a professor, wonderful man, and he showed me not only just some of the best Dickens criticism, but he also showed me it was okay to still laugh and cry when you read works of literature and you're a graduate student. And Dickens. So he always brought out in Dickens what I think still makes Dickens so popular today. Sadly, we lost Eliot, well, maybe about 15 years ago or so. He died tragically young, but I owe a lot to him. And so currently I'm the Dean of the College of General Studies at Boston University. I'm a humanities professor, and I'm a co-editor of Dickens Studies Annual and the vice president and president-elect of the Dickens Society, which is not the same thing as Tony's organization. The Dickens Society's publication is the Dickens Quarterly, not the Dickensian, but I love both institutions. I have several books on Dickens or related to Dickens. The first is Idiots, Madmen, and Other Prisoners in Dickens. The second is Suffering Mothers in Mid-Victorian Novels, so I look at Dickens and other Victorian authors. And the third is Fathers in Victorian Fiction, where I look at Dickens, and then other colleagues look at other Victorian figures. So I think that's kind of me in a nutshell in terms of my interest in Dickens.
It's interesting you mentioned Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, because I reviewed that a couple of years ago. I think it's one of the 4 or 5 best Christmas shows for children from the 60s. That, Charlie Brown, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and a couple others. But it's one of the few adaptations of A Christmas Carol that takes some things out, changes things a little bit, but I think it actually is better for it. I think that the songs and the songs in it, and also the meta aspect of that you're seeing it's a play that Mr. Magoo is starring in, gives it an added depth. And I think it's a wonderful thing. It's too bad it's sort of forgotten. It's like you look at some of the Christmas stuff that kids see now, and it's just there's no depth to it. It's just sort of like what Charlie Brown lamented about all the surface level glitz. But anyway, I'm glad to know that someone else was fond of that. Let's just talk a bit about Charles Dickens' life in general and his views and some of the main sort of points about him. One of the things that I think is the most interesting is that in the 19th century, this was before radio, this was before even the mass production of records, phonographs and whatnot, and people would go to see people giving lecture tours. These were the people who were sort of rock stars of the mid-19th century in Europe and even over here. People like Oscar Wilde, Mark Twain. But Dickens, I guess, was probably maybe the first real rock star in that sense in terms of literature. There may have been a few scientists before him that gathered big crowds, but what accounted for his popularity? Was it the serial magazine format that people read constantly, week after week? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I'll jump in just because I think I referred to one of the aspects that account for his popularity and what I just said before, and that is that he was somebody who was always very deliberately trying to get people to laugh and to cry, and so he touched people's emotions. He still does. And I suppose most authors try to, but maybe they aren't quite as successful as he is. So if you feel deeply moved to laughter or tears or both by an author, that sticks with you and it catches on.
Jay or Tony, you have a comment?
The fact that most of his novels originally appeared as serials, either weekly or monthly, enabled him to create a very special bond with his reading public. Because if you're producing a serial, you can adapt and adjust in relation to the response that you're getting back. It's not a complete ready-made whole book that you're cutting up into installment parts, but you can adjust to the way in which people are reading you, and you know whether they're reading you or not because your circulation figures will show it. And he did a great deal to adjust to the needs of a reading public and to encourage the reading public to need what he wanted to give them.
Jay, any comment from you?
Well, yes. I can be brief since they've covered most important things. But Dickens had a real genius for understanding the culture of his time. He was tacked into the romantic and the realist impulses in the 19th century and was able to speak directly to what people cared most about. And in particular, he had a passionate social conscience, and he brought out the sympathy of his readers for the underprivileged of his time.
Speaking of social conscience, it's a good segue to my next point. With in the last 25, 30 years or so, with the rise of multiculturalism and political correctness, especially here in the States, I don't know about the UK, authors like Dickens, sort of the dead white male kind of stereotype of the Western canon, they have been called out and derided for racism or colonialism or sexism or all these kinds of isms for works that were written 100, 150 some years ago. Most famously here in the U.S., Huckleberry Finn has been banned countless times for the use of the word nigger. And Charles Dickens certainly hasn't been immune from these same kind of charges. So let me just start with Tony's and ask if that same kind of feeling has pervaded the UK, and then Jay and Natalie can comment on the US. So Tony, is there sort of that kind of sort of revisionist view of Dickens as a colonialist, a racist, or whatnot?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I think what's interesting is the geographical range of enthusiasm that, for example, the Dickens Fellowship finds in its international branches. I'm sure the Dickens Society finds a similar thing with its membership. You know, that we have a branch in India, we have a branch in Japan, we have branches all over the place, and there is terrific enthusiasm for Dickens throughout the world.
How about Jay and Natalie? How about in the U.S.? Has Dickens suffered some of the slights that I've mentioned that people like Twain have?
I think that there's been a certain recognition of some of these problems, but I don't think it's ever profoundly touched his reputation in the United States, in large part because Dickens embraced contradictory impulses so fully. Dickens was a passionate anti-slavery advocate, and yet he shows some of the same 19th century attitudes towards people of color that you would expect him to show. Same with Imperial. He was horrified by some of the militaristic aspects of his society, yet he was a great patriot and a British chauvinist in countless ways. So he had this capacity to embrace all sides of views without it reducing the power of his vision at all.
Natalie?
I think it's important to put him in historic context, as the best scholars do, and as you did when you were introducing this particular question. What I find ironic is that some scholars put him in historic context and then proceed to judge him, which I don't think is the job of a literary critic, to judge somebody's soul. Obviously, he was somewhat bound to his historic context. I think given his historic context, he was pretty progressive on many of the issues that you mentioned, but I don't really see there's much to be gained by going back in time and applying our current values to somebody, who died 150 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Let me end this first segment with one final point and let you all address it. I know when I was a kid in junior high and high school, and we had to read things like David Copperfield or Great Expectations, and then we'd sometimes have to read the Russians, the Brothers Karamazov, or War and Peace or whatnot. And Dickens, in the minds of a lot of young people growing up, was one of those writers assigned that wrote these long books. But the difference between Dickens and many of the Russians I always saw was Dickens had sort of a great sense of humor. He had some of these wild, over-the-top characters. It wasn't sort of the brooding, dark, Dostoevskian approach to life. Do you think that that approach, the use of humor, is something that gives Dickens a wider appeal, and conversely also has sort of lessened him as a literary light in comparison to the Tolstoys and the Dostoevskys and the Victor Hugos, perhaps. What would you say, any of you? Natalie, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, I do think you're hitting on something in that last comment that I think sometimes Dickens has been undervalued, precisely because of his humor. Somehow, if you're not as brooding and somber all the time, you're not serious. I just completely reject that whole notion. But there have been years, particularly up to about maybe 1930, where I think Dickens was not esteemed as much as the Russians. Ironically, Dostoevsky was very influenced by Dickens, and apparently tried to imitate his humor. I just don't think it translates well. I've never read a translation of Dostoevsky that I think catches that humor very well. So I do think he's suffered a little bit for the very quality that I think makes him so appealing.
Jay or Tony?
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Tony. Go ahead.
Tolstoy as well. I mean, it was Tolstoy who said that if the whole of the world's fiction was destroyed, the one that should be saved was David Copperfield. And if the whole of David Copperfield was going to be destroyed, the chapter that should be saved is the chapter of the storm at sea with the death of Steerforth. And he called Dickens that great Christian. Dickens's humour is an essential part of him. It is what we go to him for first, I think. That wonderful collection of characters, both wicked characters, both frightening characters, and that enormous body of comic characters. That is what makes him for me.
Jay, final comment?
Yes, the comparison with Dostoevsky is illuminating. Dostoevsky's characters are all about their inner life. They're deeply psychological portraits. Dickens can capture an aspect of the inner life in a character, but he does it with a single stroke of the pen, and he makes these memorable characters that have a single feature that lives in your mind for your entire life, and symbolizes an aspect of the human psyche. But he's not, like Dostoevsky, this focused on a complex, rounded inner world of characters.
All right, well, let's end there. And in our next segment, we will talk a little bit about where Charles Dickens came from and what forces shaped him. And we'll do that in a bit. Well, in this segment, I'd like to talk a bit about Charles Dickens, the man, where he came from, biographical stuff. I was just looking, and I didn't realize that Dickens really didn't die that old. He was 1812 to 1870, so only 58 years, 57, 58 years. I always had in the back of my mind that he had to have lived a long, long time, but I guess that was a good sized age chunk in that era. But he wrote so many books and so many books that have lasted in the public imagination. I always figured he must have lived to be 80 or 90, like Thomas Hardy. So let's talk about where he came from. 1812, he's born. Was he born into a middle class family, a rural family? Was he, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? Was he a child laborer? Anyone want to jump in? Go ahead.
I'll start there, if you like. Born 1812, yes, February 1812. We're actually not too far away from his birth date, which was the 7th of February. Born in Portsea, which was just outside the city of Portsmouth in those days. It's now very much part of the city of Portsmouth. His birthplace exists as a museum, can be visited. Father was a clerk working for the Navy Office. 1812 sees us coming close to the end of the Napoleonic Wars period, and John Dickens did a lot of work dealing with the payment of sailors as they were coming back once their ships were being decommissioned. They moved around quite a bit from Portsmouth to other south coast ports and back and forth to London, where John Dickens was employed at Somerset House, and again the Navy Pay Office. So those were the early years.
What kind of family was he in? Were they particularly religious? Was it a family that was open-minded? Was he encouraged to read, or what?
Very much encouraged to read. His mother taught him to read, gave a lot of warmth, a lot of love within the family. The significant difficulty within the Dickens family was that John Dickens was not at all good at managing the finances, and that led ultimately to some very serious issues and problems for the family.
Was it a large family? Did they have a large extended family?
Yes, he had, what was it, 7 or 8 brothers and sisters, siblings. He had a significant number. Anyway, it was a large family, but not large for the time.
Mm-hmm.
Victorian families tended to be big. Dickens himself and his wife later separated from Catherine Hogarth. They had 10 children, 9 of whom survived beyond childhood.
Okay. So did he work as a child? Did he do like bootblacking or whatnot? Because I'm looking up, it says like journalism was one of his first jobs. So Natalie, it looks like you want to jump in.
No. So you asked if he was middle class. I guess maybe aspiring to be middle class, but because his father was kind of notoriously profligate with the family finances, his father was imprisoned in debtor's prison, the Marshalsea jail, which no longer exists, thank God. And then Dickens, who was 12 at the time, then had to go to work. The rest of the family, besides his sister, moved into the jail with his father. But Dickens, at age 12, was living by himself in a room in London and working at a blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles of boot blacking, and they situated him in a window so that he could be seen by passers-by, because I guess people saw this as kind of amusing and cute to see these cute little boys doing this work. But of course, he was horrified even at that age. At age 12, he had notions of really making something of himself and becoming either a great writer or somebody influential in society. So to find himself at age 12 working in a factory and kind of as a dummy in a window was crushing to him, and so much of what he writes later in life is then affected by that isolation and that fear and that what he saw as disgrace.
One of the things that's often said about that period of child employment was that it was, contrasted with some other kinds of child employment that there could have been. He did very well. It was not like going down the mines or working in the factories with every minute the risk of loss of life. But he didn't know how long it was going to last. And when he went into Warren's blacking, he had no idea whether this was going to be what life had stretching out ahead of him. And one of the reasons they put him in the window was because he became very good at tying the label, at putting the label on and tying the top of the blacking pot and putting the string around it, as he'd become very good at anything.
Many biographers view this as the motivating incident of his entire career, that this is what made Dickens so extraordinarily driven, that he resolved never again to be mortified by this kind of terrible hours of labor. He was so ashamed of what had happened to his family, and the public humiliation of it seemed to drive him to aspire to economic security above all else. So he worked harder than anybody I can think of throughout his entire life.
What about his entree into journalism? Was he a hard journalist working for newspapers? Because it looks like to me that he was doing more or less feature kind of stories for some of the magazines of the day.
Oh, no. He was a dedicated journalist. He began as a court reporter where he took down, legislative reporter reporter, where he took down the debates in shorthand and was renowned for his ability to get them out in the very next day and his speed at that. But throughout his life, he was a passionate journalist. In the early 30s, he was editor of Bentley's Miscellany. He was writing much of the newspaper all by himself. And meanwhile, he began not one, but two novels, serializing novels simultaneously while continuing his journalist career.
Was that Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist? Because I'm seeing that those were the first two novels.
That's correct.
So let's talk about those novels there, because they would have come out in his mid-20s, and both of them. I don't know if I compare them to some of the later novels, they seem fully fleshed in a sense that it doesn't seem like they are sort of the novels of a young person. Do you have a sense that he was almost fully formed as a writer when he wrote those first?
No.
Natalie, take it away.
I'll say a few things, but everyone should jump in. I love Pickwick Papers, but it really started out as sketches, and you can feel that episodic quality to it. Up until maybe about a third of the way, halfway through, I think with the development of the character of Sam Weller in particular, it started taking on more of a novel form and not just being a series of sketches. So I almost feel like it evolves into a novel as you read it. And actually, that's one of the qualities I like about it. But it's a little haphazard. A lot of great bits, but it doesn't start to congeal until about the midway point. But gentlemen, jump in.
It started out life as a collection of sporting prints by one of the greatest caricaturists of the day, a man called Robert Seymour, who had been commissioned by Chapman and Hall to put together a collection of sporting prints, which were a very popular form of graphic art at the time. And they wanted some letterpress, they wanted some text to accompany these. So they approached Dickens, who by this time had established himself as a very skillful writer of sketches of London life, the things which had been published individually in newspapers and magazines and became collected together as a volume called Sketches by Boz being the pen name that he worked under for the first few years. But once Dickens and Seymour entered into this working relationship, Dickens, the much younger man, gradually became very much the dominant partner, took the whole thing over, to the extent that Seymour became extremely depressed. Seymour ultimately took his own life. So the beginnings of Pickwick Papers were designed to be something very different. But it is, as you say, a very large, freewheeling, haphazard work, as often happens with writers, it seems to me. He needs some kind of experience, painful experience, which is going to focus his attention on what's going to happen. And that came with the death of his beloved sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth, whilst he was still writing Pickwick Papers. And the chapters in Pickwick Papers do have a darker tinge, the ones that come after the death of Mary Hogarth. It was the only time in Dickens's working career when he was absolutely a demon for getting things done on time, meeting deadlines. It was the only time in his career when he didn't.
Just looking at some of the titles, even early on, he has such memorable character names like Chuzzlewit and Rudge and Drood. Were these names that he chose symbolic in some way, like slang of the period, or were they actual names? Because there's so many names that seem like they're just made up off the top of the head for comic effect. Where did he get that aspect of his characters? Go ahead, anyone? Jay, go ahead.
They were invented. They were place names and character names that existed, names of people that existed. He was a great one for seeing things, keeping them and remembering them. He had, somebody said, a clutching eye. He would see something, it might be a piece of personal behaviour in somebody that he could use in a character later on, or it might be a name, or a name that could be slightly adapted. And once he got into the habit of writing preparatory notes for the novels, and as the career went on, he did this more and more, the opening few pages, the slips he called them, would be full of attempts at names, backwards and forwards, changing a letter here, changing a letter there, until he got something that sounded exactly what he wanted it to be. David Copperfield was going to be David Maggs, or Magsman at one point. The story of David Magg the Younger. The Chuzzlewits were Chuzzle Toes, Chuzzle this, that, and the other, until he's find it through and decided what he wants to use.
What do any of you think was the novel or the work that was his first mature work that said that this person was on a path to leaving indelible or great work behind? What do you think was sort of the first work that, was that inimitable stamp?
If he'd never written anything other than Pickwick, I think we'd still remember the novel. But another thing that's so amazing about Dickens is that he evolved throughout his career, so that he had these early novels that were much more genially humorous and much more dependent on fairy tale structure like Oliver Twist. And by the middle or toward the end of his career, he famously structured his novels much more carefully, and they were full of darker themes and organized social critique of the Crimean War or the legal system or the bureaucracy.
I'm looking too that he did looks like a handful of books that were sort of travelogue, nonfiction type books, and I generally have never really thought about him doing that. Were these books that he wrote while he was on assignment as a journalist, or was he already financially successful and just journeying abroad?
Well, he did what a lot of British writers did, and that is kind of combine travel and writing. And the first was American Notes. He came to America in 1842, and he intended to publish his observations about America, as many previous British authors had done, Captain Marryat, Martineau, and others. So he was traveling and writing, and part of it was because he thought he could kind of, build his audience that way, but he also hoped to make money on the publication, although he ended up incurring a lot of enemies in America because he kept speaking up about copyright practices, of which we had none really in America. So his publications were being reprinted over here, and he was getting none of the proceeds from that. And people thought it was kind of in bad taste for him to bring that up while he was visiting. So his journey here was a mixed bag, but ended up being very influential. And I've written about how I think his journey, particularly to Boston and Lowell, was influential in A Christmas Carol.
American Notes bears very useful and very helpful comparison with the American chapters in Martin Chuzzlewit. The two things go very effectively side by side. On both of them, he used letters that he'd written back to friends and family when he was away in America. The other one, the Pictures from Italy, is an account of his visit out there, and again, a very colourful picture of European travel.
And again, he used letters. I mean, you can see that there are whole sections that are just extrapolated directly from letters to some of his friends.
I'm looking at the works basically before 1850 because I want to talk about the major works afterwards in our next segment. And I'm looking at a lot of titles that I'm vaguely familiar with, or the only pieces that I'm really familiar with before 1850 from that we have already talked about is of course Christmas Carol and Chuzzlewit. But I'm looking at titles like The Chimes, Cricket on the Hearth, Battle of Life, Dombey and Son. Uh, Talk a little bit about what you think some of those works were like stylistically. Were they works that have been neglected, perhaps? What do you think was the best of those works that could be recommended to someone watching?
Well, you've mentioned two very different types of work from the middle period of Dickens's career. The Chimes and Cricket in the Hearth are two Christmas books that were written as sequels to the enormous success of A Christmas Carol. And the Chimes, which today many people find just really too sentimental for words, too allegorical for words. At the time of publication, caused grown men to weep. They were so moved by his depiction. But Dombey and Son is really the first of his serious, thoroughly structured, darker novels where he begins to take on large themes and organize the entire book into a coherent social criticism of the England at his time. In this case, the financial industry, the business industry rather, not the financial industry. And it foreshadows some of the books that are regarded as his greatest works, Little Dorrit, Our Mutual Friend, Bleak House.
I love Dombey and Son, but I have to echo Jay's comment. The Chimes, the Chimes, Cricket in the Hearth, Battle of Life. These are some of his Christmas books. They're almost unreadable. I'm sorry.
Massively popular in their time.
Yeah.
Enormously popular in their time. And when he started to do the public readings from 1858 onwards, Cricket on the Hearth was a real centerpiece. Cricket on the Hearth and the Carol were things that people were very keen to hear him read. The other thing about Dombey and Son is that it is the great railway novel. It contains some of the best writing about the railway age that you can find anywhere. Mr. Dombey's journey into Leamington from London is the most powerful piece of writing. And it's also, one of the things that's also said about Dickens very often is that he's not good at doing female characters, but the way in which he develops a character like Florence Dombey, or the way in which he develops Edith Granger in Dombey and Son, I think give the lie to that. I think these are most sensitive and powerful treatments, and particularly of the relationship between Florence and her father, particularly the moment when he strikes her.
One last point before we move on to the next segment, where we'll talk about some of the major works that he's most known for. Is I'm seeing a book called The Life of Our Lord. Says it's a historical book. Was this sort of like a life narrative of Jesus Christ? And what does that say about Dickens and his religious opinions?
Yes, it really is a kind of retelling of the New Testament for his children, kind of focusing on the teachings of Christ more than more than the miracles or anything. Very undogmatic. Dickens was off and on a Unitarian, so I think there's some kind of Unitarian influence there. You could also make comparisons to Thomas Jefferson's Bible, where Jefferson just took out really all of the underscored the teachings and kind of deleted all of the miracle part. So I think it pays tribute to Dickens' belief that Jesus was a great teacher and an extremely wise man, and there was much to be learned from him, and shows that while Dickens certainly had religious sentiments, he was not very dogmatic in his religious beliefs.
Any comments? Go ahead.
Especially for the children. It
Right.
wasn't written for publication. And it wasn't published. It was left to the children in Dickens' will. And it wasn't until the last of the children had died, when Henry, by then Sir Henry Fielding Dickens, had died, that the decision was taken that yes, now it could be published. And it gives, I think, a very telling account of the way Dickens saw his face and the way in which he wanted his children to see the face that he wanted to bring them up in. There's an interesting side note on that whole issue, that one of the last letters Dickens wrote on the morning of the day when he had his fatal stroke
Jay, do you have any comment?
No, I think that covered it.
Okay, well, let's end this segment, and when we get back, I want to pick up with the publication of David Copperfield and the rest of his career and the tone that Copperfield set, because I guess that Copperfield is probably one of the 3 or 4 titles that most people will associate with Dickens. We'll do that when we return. All right, as I mentioned, I want to talk about David Copperfield and some of the big uh, titles that most people identify with Copperfield. But I guess I would ask, do you guys, all of you, think that David Copperfield was one of the more momentous or works in terms of getting? Whoops, hold on, Anthony, Tony.
I think
Okay.
David Copperfield is massively important.
Okay.
It's a novel which shows Dickens going back to his own life and facing that in various very interesting ways.
Certainly, some people think that he invented an entire new genre. He certainly was made it so memorable and powerful as an option for writers, the autobiographical novel. And so there's a great deal from his life in David Copperfield, and it comes through both as emotion but also as artistry.
Natalie, you got a comment?
I agree, and although I have my personal preference is Great Expectations, which I think was very influenced. It's a very similar book, but by a more mature writer, and so there's a lot of David Copperfield and Great Expectations, and I'm more of a fan of the second, but love them both, of course.
Yeah, I agree. Those are the 2 books I remember I had to read in junior high, and I always preferred Great Expectations. Pip, I think, is a bit more, I don't know, he seems a wiser character than David Copperfield.
Yes.
But Copperfield, and I'm less familiar with some of the earlier works, but Copperfield seemed to be me where we get secondary and tertiary level characters that are sort of indelible. And that's one of the things that you think of in a Charles Dickens novel, is that even if you don't like the protagonist or are not drawn to the protagonist, there's always some colorful little character scurrying in the back or doing something, abusing someone, blustering about or something. Let's just talk a little bit about some of the structure of his most famous works, Copperfield and on. What are some of the most memorable characters, and did Dickens actually strive for that, or is that something that came out of public appeal with the serialization of the stories? Anyone, go ahead.
Well, one of my favorites, I just love the Peggottys. I love the Peggottys boathouse in David Copperfield, and I just think it was such an appealing and attractive construction there. And one of the things I've written about in the past is how Dickens has several of these kinds of, I call them theatrical abodes. They're homes, they're real domiciles, but they're in strange places, or there's some kind of element of theater to them that makes them even kind of warmer and cozier and inviting. But I think Tony mentioned earlier the clutching eye of Dickens. I think, Tony, is the phrase you're quoting. I think that's one of the things that really helped him nail these really idiosyncratic characters that are so appealing. And I completely agree with you, Dan. Sometimes it's those peripheral characters that really end up being the things that draw you into the book the most. So he did have this encyclopedic memory, and he was a keen observer, and so he would pick things up on the street, and he would pull them together, and they would come out as these just absolutely memorable, kind of fully fleshed out characterizations. But as Jay was saying earlier, maybe not fully fleshed out in an interior landscape, but externally, and externally in ways that kind of point to what might be happening internally.
Let's talk then about some of the social aspects and the social criticism in some of the major books, because we deal with child labor in some books. We deal with I would guess abuse. There's hints, I guess, of sometimes pedophilia, prostitution, sexual deviancy in the Victorian age. Do you think those things helped or hurt the books in terms of sales or literature? Do you think some some of the ways some of these things were portrayed, sometimes in a comic fashion, suited or sort of maybe dampened some of the impact that the books might have had in terms of, say, later critics looking at the books and sort of dismissing Dickens as, not as serious as, let's say, the Russians or Hugo or people like that. What about the social criticism in a lot of these books? Do you think it's, helped or hindered?
It's massive. Sorry, Jay, go on, you go.
I was just going to say that the humor with which he treated some of these serious social ills vastly helped him both in popularity at the time and in later critical estimation. He was seen as a brilliant satirist, so that the genial humor of his early novels becomes transmuted into a sharp-eyed satire that took down some of the abuses of his age. And I think even today, Oscar Cuellar wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel in 2001 that took off from Dickens as a way to attack social abuses in New York City. People are still living with that legacy of Dickens's satiric eye.
Speaking of taking on issues, Bleak House is one of those books that is really a scathing look at sort of the English class system and the English justice system. It's a book I only read, I guess, in my late teens, early 20s, but I still remember it being one of the more political works of his. Can any of you sort of jump in and talk a little bit about that book and the sort of views of society that Dickens espouses in that book?
Well, one thing, the term Bleak House, or the title Bleak House, obviously refers to a specific house, but it's also a metaphor for all of England and corruption and ineffective practices, particularly in the Chancery Court system in terms of that plot, but kind of reverberating out throughout society. In Little Door, he has the image of the Circumlocution Office and its attempt to perfect how not to do it, and that's a kind of social criticism that I comes to mind almost every day of my life, sadly, as I'm dealing with government bureaucracy or the social security system or healthcare industry. So there are definitely critiques in those two books, Bleak House and Little Door, that just personally really reverberate for me today.
There's a lot about Bleak House which, putting it back into its place in Dickens's canon, there's a lot about Bleak House which is a response to what else was going on in the early 1850s. The Great Exhibition, which was on in Hyde Park in 1851 and was a celebration of achievements as the workshop of the world, Britain as the most important nation in the world, as being much too self-satisfied to be demonstrating those kinds of things at a time where there were so many social ills being left unattended. This is a period of time where there is massive outbreak of disease going on through London repeatedly. There is no real attention being paid to public health issues. And he uses Bleak House, he uses particularly Tom All Alone's The Infested Slum, which is very close to some of the grander properties in that novel, uses that very much as an indication of things not being done. And I think you're quite right about Little Dorrit, the how not to do it business and the Circumlocution Office, which of course is in part a reaction against the incompetence of the government handling of the Crimean War. So all of the time he's connecting up with the big issues that are going on, forcing those into people's consciousness.
At the same time that he was engaging in this really powerful social satire, he was not neglecting formal innovation. Bleak House is a novel which has two different points of view and alternate between first-person narrative with Esther Summerson and third-person narrative throughout the novel. And this enabled him to encompass vast sweeps of English society within a single coherent platform. And it added to the power of his satire that it was not just simply a polemic, but rather embedded in a rich work of art.
Natalie, you mentioned earlier on Dickens' ability to make a scroll.
Just had a little issue there technically. Tony, if you can just pick up on what you were stating.
I was picking up Natalie's point from earlier on, the importance of Dickens' power to make us weep and to be in connection with our emotions, both laughing and crying. And I think he does that very powerfully in Bleak House with the death of Joe, the illiterate crossing sweeper, dying thus around us every day. And the rhythms slip into blank verse as he's presenting that scene, but it's an immensely powerful scene.
I've never read it without crying. I've never read it without crying. I'm tearing up now just hearing you talk about it. It's beautiful.
Let me just go back to the beginning. We had talked that Dickens' first book was Sketches by Boz, short stories, and I'm looking at his bibliography, and short stories pop up and recur throughout his 30-plus year career in writing. Before we get to some of the later works, some of the bigger and I think his best work, let's talk a little bit about Dickens as the short story writer versus the writer of the multi-layered novels. How did he improve? How did he grow, if he did? How did he change? What was the arc of his career as a short fictionist?
So the early works, shorter works you're talking about in Sketches by Boz are literally sketches. They're London life observed by a man strolling through the streets of London. By the middle of his career, his short stories began to take on more fully developed narrative genres, so that he wrote ghost stories and adventure stories, proto-mysteries. He really began to experiment with using a short story to explore a particular type of short fiction.
Natalie, any comment?
No, I would just echo what Jay said. He really does evolve. There are some brilliant bits in Sketches by Boz, but it really starts pulling together to something much richer later in his career, although I don't think any of his short fiction holds a candle to his longer fiction.
Yeah. How about you, Tony?
It's a very different kind of writing, the things that you're looking at. When you look at that, I mean, you have one body of those shorter pieces comes in the Christmas stories, and the Christmas stories which were published regularly in his journals, and then were collected together as separate stories. By the time he was doing that, they weren't necessarily stories with a Christmas twist to them, but they were stories which developed characters and so on, and invited other writers to share the writing with him. But for me, the most important in those pieces of shorter writing comes in all the year round from 1860 onwards, when he invents the persona of the uncommercial traveller. And he produces in that last 10 years of his life some of the finest shorter essay writing that we have in the language. And I think those are absolutely wonderful things. They pick up all of Dickens's major themes, and they show the development of his approach and the development of his personality. So I'd always recommend the Uncommercial Traveller essays as being highly significant.
In America, around the same time that Dickens was in his heyday, you had sort of the development of the short story and fiction, from the Edgar Allan Poe type things to some of the shorter works of Melville, and then later Twain. I don't know if I've ever read or heard about, were there any writers that were on a par in terms of notoriety, of fame, or audience appeal as Dickens in England at the time? Or was he sort of away and above the rest of the competition? Or had the people who might have been as popular in his day just sort of faded because their work wasn't any good?
Do you mean as popular in England or as popular in America as Dickens was in England?
Well, anyway, because last year I was reading through a lot of public domain works, and for example, there was a lot of stuff like one of the big long works was Varney the Vampire, which is an amusingly bad, but almost funny kind of bad serial of a million plus words about this pre Dracula type vampire. What were the serialized stories in that vein, and that Dickens stood out as someone major, or were there, presumptive rivals in that day that have simply been forgotten?
I don't think they've been forgotten at all. Dickens had one major rival in popularity, and that was Thackeray. But this was the great age of the English novel. George Eliot was writing, Trollope was immensely popular. Elizabeth Gaskell, who mastered the short story form in her amazing book Cranford, which was popular and influential on both sides of the Atlantic. You had all three of the Bronte sisters, who increasingly acquired fame as the century went on. Of course, well after Dickens, you had Hardy, who was in the vein of some of George Eliot's work. No, I think that quite the contrary. The British novel in the 19th century dominated the world in a way that the American novel did not. The American novel has been recognized retrospectively as a fine achievement, but at the time, the British novel was seen as really the height of world literature.
If you're looking at the popular end of the market, you have to take account of the work of G.W.M. Reynolds, who produced a vast work called The Mysteries of London, certainly aimed to titillate, certainly aimed to attract readers by having all kinds of interesting angles on the behaviour of his characters. And Dickens, at one stage in his career, was very much vying with Reynolds for the popular end of the market. It's an interesting element that both Dickens and Reynolds, and indeed Henry Mayhew, the great proto-sociologist, all had offices in Wellington Street near Covent Garden, all at the same time, so they were working very close to one another. But Reynolds was certainly saw himself, and at times Dickens saw him, as a great rival for the popular end of the market. Dickens, of course, was writing better material than Reynolds, and I think everybody would accept and agree with that, but it's certainly part of the contest for the market.
Well, let's move on to what I probably would consider sort of the twin towers or the twin titans of his later work, and probably of his whole career. We had mentioned with Natalie a little earlier Great Expectations, but Tale of Two Cities to me seemed, at least in memory, it's been a few years since I read that, it seems to me to be his sort of attempt at that sprawling historical epic along the lines of a Hugo or the Russians. And then you get this very, I think, the best portrait of an individual and his life struggles with Pip in Great Expectations. So there are two novels that I think have two different aims, but they succeed excellently in what they were doing. So if we want to take the first one that came along, A Tale of Two Cities, if any of you want to just talk a little bit about that, and was he trying to do this big epic Hugo-esque type work in that?
I'll just jump in, but mainly because one of my favorite Dickens novels, which we haven't mentioned because nobody ever mentions it, is Barnaby Rudge.
Oh, okay.
Earlier in his career, I guess it's his fifth work, and it's also a tale of a revolutionary moment. The Gordon riots, anti-Catholic riots in the 1780s, And it's not most people's favorite novel, but I love it, and I kind of consider it a warm up to Tale of Two Cities because he invests himself in the fury of the crowd and the riots and the burning and burning alcohol in the street in a way that ends up being very informative to how he deals with those matters in Tale of Two Cities, and in both, I think that he's certainly making a social critique, and he's warning England of what might be if some of these social ills that he's addressed are not dealt with, right? If you continually ignore the poor, what do you have? You have revolution, right? So that's why A Tale of Two Cities is two cities. It's Paris, but also London, right? And London better take note of what happened in Paris, or it could happen in London too. So I think that he was going for the big historic epic novel, but you can see in it a lot of the same continuing concerns in terms of the social ills he's been addressing. So I'll shut up there and let the others jump in.
I mean, that justly famous opening sequence of A Tale of Two Cities. He says, so far like the present period, which underlines that similarity. And the French Revolution wasn't so many years earlier, and it was still very much there in people's consciousness. It's the nearest equivalent for us is like thinking about the end of World War II. It's still there in people's consciousnesses. Barnaby Rudge, I think, is an underrated novel in all sorts of ways, and it, of course, with its dealing with the Gordon riots, is responding to the Chartism movement of that time, and a lot of his writing in that reflects things he'd seen as he travelled around the country, where Chartist agitation was going on. So his consciousness of, again, what's happening in the national life is picked up by all of these things. But yes, I agree with you entirely. I think Tale of Two Cities is a massive warning, and it's got one of the best conclusions he ever wrote.
Anthony and Natalie have really hit it on the nail, particularly with the comparison with Barnaby Rudge, his other great historical novel about revolution. One thing I want to add is the development of Dickens' symbolic power by the time he wrote Tale of Two Cities. Now, think about the guillotine and Madame Lafarge sitting and knitting, and how that resonates in your memory. Once you've read that, that becomes your total image of the horrors of the revolution.
So let's move on to Great Expectations. That's probably the book that even now, 30 some years after I first read it, always sticks in my mind. Partly, I think there was the film in 1938 where Pip and who was the great beauty who played the love interest in that. But it's one of those books that you can rework into modern situations and modern times. It's almost like I would guess you call it an archetypal book, because it's I could imagine a science fiction novel that was based upon it set 1,000 years from now around another star with a similar set of characters and a similar set of human situations. To me, it's one of his great explorations of what it is to be human. So let's talk a little bit of how that came about. Natalie, you had mentioned David Copperfield in comparison to it and favoring Great Expectations. Maybe if you could give us sort of 3 or 4 points as to why you think Great Expectations expounded upon some of the things that Copperfield brought up and bettered it.
Right. I prefer the character of Pip to David. I think maybe because it's a more honest portrayal of a human being. I think you did hit the nail on the head when you said that it really gets to the heart of what it means to be human. And part of what it means to be human is to have regrets, to know that you've done things wrong, and to know that there's really not much you can do about what you've done wrong. And I think when Dickens wrote David Copperfield, he was not ready to acknowledge that, about himself at any rate. And I think by the time he wrote Great Expectations, obviously very ironically titled, he was mature enough to know to understand himself a little bit better and to know that there were things that he had done wrong that he could not take back, and that was part of what makes us human. And so I think it's just the resonance of that of regret, and it's this beautiful elegiac tone that is wound throughout that novel that I think makes it really resonate for me, and obviously for a lot of readers. And the David Lean film version, just brilliant. It's wonderful.
It's a
I
great
also
novel about
good.
forgiveness, isn't it? It's a great novel about compassion, which is the best of us. It's the best of human beings to be compassionate. And through that novel, it happens again and again. Miss Havisham says to Pip, "Right, I forgive her." When just before Mrs. Jello dies, she says, "Joe, Pip, forgive." It resonates all the way through that novel. It was Gene Simmons who played Estella.
That's right.
I
I think Miss Havisham is probably not only the most complex of, if you want to call it, villains in his works, but she's also one of the things that makes her so memorable is she's so relatable. You can understand her motives, and it's not. I mean, some of the other major characters that you can think of that are sort of over the top. You could almost see them in a musical version when they did Oliver Twist or something. You can see people, these big over the top characters. But Havisham to me always seemed to be very grounded in reality. A character, also the fact that she's a woman who is basically the puppet master of the book, which is an interesting thing. So maybe I'll ask that. Havisham is such a well-developed character, even though she doesn't dominate the book in terms of page time. Would you consider her the finest female character that because someone had mentioned Dickens was not noted for female characters? So talk about Miss Havisham, maybe Natalie, if you wanted to go first.
Okay. Well, no, you're absolutely right. It's a brilliant characterization. It's one of his studies, and not the only one, of what happens when somebody is trapped in their past and cannot move past their own past, their own the sins that have been done against them, or the sins that they've committed, and incredibly tragic that way. And yes, she's one of the most complicated because she is villainous in a way because she has manipulated both Pip and Estella, and hurt both of them. But she's so much a victim herself that you can't damn her. She's just a complicated, difficult, and as Jay was saying, incredibly symbolic person. I mean, boy, just the visual elements of Miss Havisham and the Saddest House, that sticks with you. It's a haunting image, right? Almost literally. She haunts her own house, right? Even before she dies. So I'll let others speak about that, though.
Tony?
And she haunts us, and I think that it is the power of those images of the white wedding dress, the rotting cake, the final conflagration when she goes up in flames at the end, that stick with you and testify to something that Dickens achieved later in his career, which is tapping directly into the unconscious. Miss Havisham is not a terribly complex character, but she's a character that haunts you because of the power of her unconscious and reaching out and touching yours.
Tony, comment?
No, nothing to add. Says it all.
Okay. Let me just turn then to, it looks like the final two major works or novels that he had done in his life. And one, Our Mutual Friend, I really don't know anything about. And The Mystery of Edwin Drood, I do remember being a Broadway musical being made of it. But other than that, and it being unfinished at the time of his death, I really don't know much about it. So can any of you speak to those two final works, what they were about? Was there, did they act as sort of a capstone to a career, or was he, if he had lived another 10, 15, 20 years, do you think he would have grown and changed a bit more as a writer?
Our Mutual Friend, he said, takes him back to the big canvas and the big brushes. Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations had both been weekly serials published in all the year round. With our mutual friend, he went back to the monthly serialized format. That gave him more room to develop, to spread himself. It's really, I think, the third in that sequence of massive London novels, analysis of English society that starts with Bleak House, goes through Little Dorrit and ends with Our Mutual Friend. And I think they are all massive works and massive achievements. For a long time, Our Mutual Friend was my favourite Dickens novel. I think it has such richness, paraphrasing Mr. Squeers, I think it has such richness all the way through in its character creation and the way in which it creates this world symbolically. We've been talking a lot about symbols. Symbolically, the dust heaps representing a world which is built on filth and rubbish, with this poisonous river snaking its way through the centre of the city. I think it's an enormously powerful novel, and one I would rate very, very highly amongst those three important London social novels. Drood is, well, no, I'll stop on that. Come back on Drood when we talk about it.
Stop on that because you said it so well. That was beautifully expressed and captures Our Mutual Friend and what it means to me exactly.
Well, let's then turn to Edwin Drood. It's his final work, unfinished. Again, I know very little of it other than it was made into maybe 30 years ago into a big budget musical on Broadway. What is the theme of that book? And as I said, is this a book that would have been sort of a capstone, or do you think that had he survived, he would have gone and done more works, or was it going into a new direction, perhaps?
Well, it's a murder mystery, or presumably a murder mystery, because he does not get far enough along. He's about at the halfway point when he dies. We assume Edwin Drood has been murdered. It looks like he's been murdered. In fact, all the evidence seems to point to his uncle being the murderer, but there are many writers out there who will contend with me on that. There are many theories about how Edwin Drood was supposed to end. I think maybe it is actually a more successful murder mystery novel left unfinished than it might have been finished. It certainly has attracted maybe more attention than it would have. He was definitely influenced by his friend Wilkie Collins, who had successfully published The Moonstone, and I always think they were good friends. They traveled together, but there was some rivalry there too. So I think Dickens wanted to best Wilkie with this mystery, and unless I'm mistaken, I think he got to the halfway point and realized he'd already kind of let the cat out of the bag. I don't know how he was going to work his way out of that, but I've never been able to imagine Dickens living much beyond when he did, because at age 58 he had worked himself to death. He's one of, I think, many authors in the 19th century who worked themselves to death. I think George Eliot also. I can't say that of Charlotte Bronte, because she really died of morning sickness, but so many of the really great 19th century novelists, even Thackeray, right? Thackeray wrote himself into exhaustion. So I can't. I think Drood ends in the perfect place, halfway through. Leave it up to us, as that musical does that you mentioned, and let Dickens go off and get some rest.
Dan, be careful. If you start reading Drood, it will break your heart. Natalie may be right that he left it at the perfect place, but I find it to be tormenting. Each time I read it, I'm so immersed in this wonderful piece of writing that I can hardly believe that it's come to an end. I turn the page and I see the end of the book. I go, no, not that, not now. So be careful if you do read it.
Tony? But it's worth reading because I think one of the problems with The Mystery of Edwin Drood is that it's excited much more interest for what isn't there. than for what isn't. I think what is very rewarding. Again, I think there's a tremendous amount of wonderful Dickens characterization. The last in that whole series of street children comes in this novel in the form of the deputy. These wonderful figures like Durdles, the drunken stonemason. There are terrific creations going on here. The Billiken, the London landlady. He's doing a terrific amount, and we don't know. And we simply have to be satisfied with not knowing, I think.
But definitely it is worth reading. I didn't mean to be dismissive, because that last chapter of Drood that he finished, it sounds like he's almost signing off, because he writes about, looking into the Rochester Cathedral, cloister, I'm sorry, but it is Rochester, and how the space speaks of the resurrection and the life. It definitely sounds like a farewell, like he's dealing with his own mortality.
There's some wonderful writing, I think. It's really beautifully done. Those passages that you quoted, and the resurrection and the life, but isn't it also wonderfully striking that the very last word in that novel, the last word of fiction Dickens ever wrote, is appetite. Because above all, he had that for life and living and achievement and everything.
Well, let me end this penultimate segment with this final question about the style of Dickens. Tony, you had seemed to delineate a difference between the books that were the weekly serials and the monthly serials, and that the monthly serials were the longer works that were maybe one might call them more serious works that looked at society or the political sense of the day. If you were to compare the two types of works by that monthly versus weekly serialization, what things can you look pro or con? What were some of the weaknesses of one side and pros of the other, and vice versa?
No, I wasn't intending to suggest that at all. I just think that there are virtues in having to do a weekly serial because it tightens up what you're doing. He's got to work faster. He didn't find it comfortable. He said it was like writing in teaspoonfuls. The bigger monthly, taking year and a half to complete, places all sorts of other constraints on you, all sorts of other things you've got to do. We've talked a bit about Dickens and caricature, the Dickens picking out a single detail about a character and repeating it. How do you keep a character in people's consciousnesses over a period like 18 months unless you give them something very precise and very clear that they can hook onto, a trick of speech, a trick of movement, of behavior? So there are all kinds of things that he can do to handle both of those particular art forms. I don't think at all that any of them are better than others. No.
You bring up a good point about the serialization and the need to sort of have the same little character ticks play out over and again. I know when I was young, my dad used to, on public television here in the U.S., we used to watch like the Flash Gordon serials from the 1930s together, and this was when he was a boy. He would go and see them, and you would see sort of the same tropes over and over again. Looking back now with a century and a half removed between us and Dickens, do you think that sort of need to constantly in every episode sort of recount this or display that, do you think that sort of dates the work or somehow blunts it or maybe turns off a modern reader?
I don't think so. I see it in Downton Abbey all the time, and Downton Abbey is enormously popular. I also see it in Game of Thrones. Many similar techniques. Downton being maybe closer to Dickens' realm than Game of Thrones, but I see them using that as a way of keeping a huge cast of characters nicely delineated. But one thing that kind of reassures me when I occasionally cannot remember the name of a minor character, something everyone likes to try to catch me on for some reason, Dickens sometimes himself had trouble remembering some of the names of his minor characters, so you can see in some of the initial versions of his novels that he will pick up on a character and call his own character the wrong name.
I think there's a real synergy between the necessity of reminding the readers of these characters and one aspect of Dickens' genius. If you compare his works with, say, Trollope, who also serialized novels of enormous length, you find Trollope is much more ponderous as he begins each serial part, kind of recapping the plot for you, and at times repeating entire paragraphs, just paraphrasing them, but essentially the same. And if you're reading it in a volume and just going from beginning to end, you recognize how much more effective Dickens's method of caricature is for keeping you in touch with the lifeblood of these characters.
All right, well, let's end this segment. And the final segment, I want to talk about a little bit of the influences on Dickens and the influences that he had on later writers, as well as how the last 100+ years have seen Dickens seen critically and what the future of Dickensia might be. So we'll do that when we return. Well, I'd like to wrap up the show talking about Dickens through the decades and the last century and a half or so. But before we do that, let's just talk. We talked basically about Dickens in a sense, almost as if he just appeared out of nowhere. But he must have been influenced when he was young in reading certain writers, certain stories. Who do you think had the biggest influence on him on a personal level and also stylistically?
The 18th century novelists were a huge influence on him. Fielding, in particular, he loved reading, and some of the episodic nature of his early novels, as we said earlier, like Pickwick or Nicholas Nickleby, come out of the very episodic novels like Tom Jones, etc. So that's an initial huge influence, and I'll let the others add some others.
Arabian Nights.
Yeah.
Amongst the other 18th century novelists, big influence on him was Smollett. Yeah. And Smollett's creation of grotesque characters was something that he picks up. But the contemporary writers, I mean, Harrison Ainsworth was an influence. People tend not to read Harrison Ainsworth much nowadays, but he was a big influence and very popular at the time. But the biggest, closest influence would have been Sir Walter Scott, because Dickens certainly felt with his need to write the historical novel that he needed to write something that Scott might have approved of and might have written. So Walter Scott had an enormous influence and an enormous hold over the imaginations of the reading public at the early part of the 19th century.
How about Swift and his satire of English society? And also, I'm thinking, perhaps did Dickens read any of Cervantes? Because when I think of Quixote and Sancho Panza, their relationship and the constant, the main character basically being set up as a fool for the pranks behind the back of a secondary character seems to be something that Dickens, if he never did read Cervantes, somehow influenced him. So maybe is Swift and Cervantes somehow have any influence, do you think?
You got it just right about Cervantes. You can certainly see it in David Copperfield, of course, with Sam Weller. Excuse me, Pickwick Papers with Sam Weller. What a mistake. But Swift, I'm not as certain about. I don't recall him having had a deep relationship with Swift.
Well, let's look the other direction then. What novelists, say, directly after his life, say in the late Victorian period, and anyone even in the last 100 years, does Dickens still have an influence, or is he sort of looked at sort of as an old curio?
Mind if I just jump in? As I was doing so anyway. I think initially after his death, a lot of novelists were tailoring themselves maybe more after George Eliot, and so the kind of caricaturish nature of some of Dickens' fiction went out of style. But I think actually in the last 50 years or so, people have developed, I think, a richer understanding of Dickens' value, and you see more authors kind of patterning themselves after Dickens quite consciously. John Irving always talks about Dickens being an enormous influence on his work, and one of my favorite books from the last 10 years, Donna Tartt's Goldfinch, is very influenced by Dickens, and she specifically references Dickens multiple times in that novel. So those are just two from the last, 25 years or so.
William Boyd's novels about London, novels by Ian Rankin, McEwan, these also pick up elements of Dickens. Stephen King, writing The Green Mile some years ago, makes again absolutely direct and specific reference to Dickens and his capacity to create a page turner, to focus the attention of readers through serialization. So yes, there are big influences.
We could keep naming individual authors on and on. Peter Carey wrote Jack Maggs, but I'd like to quit it. Jack Maggs is a direct rewrite of Great Expectations, but I'd like to generalize it by saying that there's now a very fashionable genre that's sometimes called neo-Victorian fiction, which has been inspired greatly by Dickens, so that you have a whole category of fiction today that seems to be an outgrowth of Dickens and some other late 19th century writers.
Lots of attempted conclusions to the mystery of Edwin Drood, of course, come within all that.
I have last weekend I did a show on Kurt Vonnegut, and even though Vonnegut's style is very different, it's much shorter sentences. I've always found his humor and his outlook on American society to be very similar in the 20th century to what Dickens did to 19th century Britain. Do any of you see something akin to that in their approaches?
Well, I certainly see in both a great sense of the absurd, sometimes absurd, in a humorous sense, but often absurd taken to the point of like almost tragedy. So that would be one thing I would see in common between those two.
So let's talk then about his critical legacy. If he died in 1870, did he, as often happens, did his works fall out of fashion? Did it go into eclipse and then come back? Because famously, Melville was forgotten for decades until his centenary. What has been sort of the roller coaster, if there was one, of the critical assessment of Dickens versus those that were his peers and people who came later on?
Yes, the case is a little different from Melville's. Melville fell into complete obscurity. Dickens was never unpopular with general readers. There was at no point since his death was he not a massive favorite of general readers. But he did fall into great disfavor among the critics. And it wasn't until the 1930s, as I believe Anthony mentioned very early in one of the earlier segments, that he began to experience a certain critical revival, particularly because of a great essay by Edmund Wilson, the American critic, called The Two Scrooges, but also because of a wonderful essay by George Orwell a little bit later in the 40s. Through the 40s and 50s, he began to be taken up by the new critics. Lionel Trilling played a huge role in his revival at that period. And then, ever since the 40s and 50s, there's just been waves of critical movement, one after another, that has taken up Dickens as one of their big test cases. So that you had feminist critics using Dickens often to criticize him, but nonetheless to think through his works. Phenomenologists and deconstructionists have all worked on Dickens. So today you get the global Dickens that, again, we mentioned in an earlier program, where people are thinking about how Dickens responded to the has global reach in its time.
Tony, do you have any comment on that?
I've got some extra bits I'd like to add if I'm allowed
Go ahead.
to do that, because
Yeah.
I think there are areas that we haven't really touched on, and if we want to try and give a rounded sense of what Dickens' achievement was, I think we do need to mention them. And that high on that list for me would be Dickens' two major journals that he conducted or edited during the last 20 years of his life: Household Words from 1850 to 59, and All the Year Round from 1859 on beyond Dickens' death. These were massively popular, enormous popular appeal, tuppence a week, and presenting 22,000 words in close double column type, no illustrations, including some of Dickens's finest fiction that we have talked about. All the Year Round included Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. Household Words included Hard Times, and included fine novels, fine works by other writers, Wilkie Collins, Elizabeth Gaskell, But as well as those, as well as works of fiction, there was poetry, there were short stories, and there were non-fiction articles taking on the world of mid-Victorian England. And if you want a good window on the world of mid-Victorian England, then you could do a lot worse than read Household Words and All the Year Round. They are, I think, very, very high on the importance level of what Dickens achieved and what he left behind him. The other things that he left behind him, of course, are public reading texts, are speeches made in public. He never took notes, never worked from notes when he was making speeches. He had it all in ear. And those are important things. We have fortunately got all of that available to us now. And finally, and something he would perhaps have had doubts about whether he'd wanted it to be widely available, but his letters. 12 volumes in the Pilgrim edition of Dickens's letters, 14,000 letters to 2,500 identifiable correspondents and many unidentifiable correspondents, and new letters keep turning up. He keeps on writing.
Oh, well, let's then take a look here. We're in the year 2016 as we tape. Where does Dickens stand now? And if we look with an eye towards the future, both in terms of reading and critically, do you think Dickens will endure? And I think I had earlier said, I could see a lot of the stories being set, centuries from now on another planet, perhaps, because they have such a human element. Where do you see Dickens into the future?
I think that he will survive and continue to thrive for many reasons, many of which we have already said. It's that ability to make you laugh, to make you cry, and do so maybe within the same chapter. His ability to be translated to film will also help a lot, as we've seen many very successful film versions or BBC versions of his novels, and that continues to happen. Sergei Eisenstein wrote an excellent essay, I think back in the 1920s, about how filmic Dickens was, and how Dickens, even before film was invented, seemed to have created things like the close-up, so that if you look at the way he will set a scene, he may start kind of at a distance and then kind of narrow in on maybe a boiling kettle of tea or something, and that's such a filmic device. So I think his transferability to film will help a lot, and I also think that the way he characterizes the evils of having a great disparity between the rich and the poor is something that is as pertinent today as it was in his own time, both here in the U.S., in Europe, and maybe even more so in third world countries. So there's his works still matter. They still speak to us. They are still as relevant, I think, as they were 150 plus years ago.
Well, let's wrap up the show, and I'll go left to right, starting with Tony. If you want to just take a minute or two and sum up any final thoughts about Dickens and/or thoughts why anyone watching this who's not familiar should read, and what might be the 2 or 3 works that would be a good entree into Dickens. Tony?
Yeah, just read him, enjoy him. I've mentioned the Uncommercial Traveller essays. Those are gems in a brief compass. Great Expectations, certainly. And some of the non-fictional journalism.
Jay, any final thoughts from you?
Well, Great Expectations is the place to begin for adults. I think that you can see what a mature writer he is in Great Expectations. Christmas Carol is where to begin for everyone else, including adults who are children at heart.
Natalie, final thoughts from you?
I would definitely echo read A Christmas Carol. So many people have seen so many versions of it, but it's an exceedingly readable novella. And the writing is gorgeous. It may be his most well-made piece of fiction. It is tight, but there are also just these fantastic scenes of description which you just can't get in a film version. So I would start there. Great Expectations, absolutely, and my favorite, Barnaby Rudge.
Well, that ends the show. I just want to say that I know when I was a kid, I'd often have to wait to check out books, whether it was Dickens or anyone else. Nowadays, you can just download from Kindle, go to a Project Gutenberg. You can get basically, I think, all of Dickens, all of these writers that have been mentioned in the 19th century, and it's for free. I wish that public domain laws or copyright laws were not as Mickey Mouse Disneyfied as they were, because I think there's a lot of work that gets neglected because of that. But certainly Dickens is available, and he's free, and you can download not only just the writing, but some of the stuff that you can get on Project Gutenberg will have some of those original illustrations that have been mentioned, and some of them are as memorable as some of the writing. So again, I want to thank Natalie, Jay, and Tony. Next week, I will be talking with a philosopher on the nature of evil. So that's up Dickens' alley too. So again, thanks to all three of you.
Thanks, Dan. Bye, Jay. Bye, Tony. Bye, Dan.
Hey.
Thank you.
One.
What larks?
Okay.
What larks?